Good evening.
Good evening. I said this last week, I'll probably say it all during the summer. It's hard to think of it as evening when it's so bright outside. But so be it, it's evening. Oh my goodness. Just a little quick sidestep on the Assumption of Our Lady. I was listening to Catholic radio, and I got a real interesting insight into the Assumption of Our Lady I never thought of before to share with non-Catholic Christians. Non-Catholic Christians, like I used to be, believe in something called the rapture. You may or may not have heard about it. It's this belief that Jesus is going to come back, but in secret. He's going to snatch up all the Christians off of the world in a kind of a moment and take them into heaven before the revelation of the Antichrist onto the world. And after which, basically, hell is unleashed on earth under the reign of the Antichrist. And woe to you who didn't accept Christ as your Lord and Savior before the rapture, because then you'll have to suffer through the tribulation and you'll be persecuted by the Antichrist and you'll have to go through martyrdom. Okay? Well, I believed that for many, many years. I defended it, I promoted it, I taught it, I showed you where in the scriptures you could find it, etc., and never thought anything more about it. I just presumed it. Well, when I converted to Catholicism, there was a very interesting thing I was confronted with. The rapture is nowhere in the Bible, according to the Catholic Church. And it's nowhere in tradition. There is no tradition of this. When you study the history of the rapture, the belief of this secret snatching away of believers, it goes back to the late, or actually early mid-century, 1840s and 50s is when it began. And prior to that, there's no evidence of this belief at all. There's just none. And when you look at the scriptures that are used to support the rapture, what you find is that they are a misreading of what we understand as the second coming. So there is no rapture. Jesus, when he comes back again, he's not going to come back and steal away a bunch of people magically and then come back again for everyone to see. That's not going to happen. When Jesus comes back again, believe me, every eye shall see him. There will be a shout and a trumpet sound of an archangel to gather the dead in Christ, to rise with him and to meet him in the air, and we who are alive and remain will be transformed, like we read in the preface for today's meditation. To meet him in the air, so shall we forever be with the Lord. That is the end of time. It's not a secret rapture. Well, how does this relate to the Assumption? Well, one of the things that non-Catholic Christians believe is in this rapture. It's this idea that you will just be transformed. Well, that's what happened to Our Lady. So one could say to non-Catholic Christians who believe in the rapture that Our Lady was the first person to be raptured. Because what they describe is exactly what the Assumption is. And I never made that connection before, but it was right. Our Lady was the first person to be raptured. Her body isn't here. She's been transformed. She is like her Son in a glorified human body and soul together in a permanent union, just like Jesus, which is a prefigurement of what will happen to all of us at the end of time, at the first resurrection. She just got it a little early. But it's interesting like I said, I never made that connection. So when you talk to non-Catholic Christians about the Assumption, this is a point of connection that you can talk with. You say, you believe in the rapture, right? Well, we as Catholics believe that Mary was the first person to be raptured. That's a good way to kind of make that bridge. Yes, ma'am.
Do all Protestants believe in the rapture?
No, not all Protestants believe in the rapture. She asked, do all Protestants? When I talk, and that's a good point to bring up. When I talk about non-Catholic Christians, for the most part, I'm talking about what would be classified as evangelical Protestants. These are the ones that you typically hear on the radio, the ones that you hear on television broadcasts, you know, the televangelists and so forth, would be roughly categorized in that sphere, okay? Because the basic theology that they promote is roughly the same. Okay? But no, it's not true. Not all non-Catholic Christians believe this. For example, in the Greek Orthodox Church, they don't have any idea about this. This is a foreign idea to Eastern Rite Christians. They believe in the second coming like we do. There's no rapture. It's a modern Protestant invention. And when I mean modern, I mean within under 200 years. So the Reformers didn't even believe in it. The early revivalists, the Wesleys, the founders of Methodism, they didn't believe in it. It came about around mid-1840s and 50s. And it caught on, and it's now just assumed doctrine. So I just thought I would throw that out there in case you talk to non-Catholic Christians and they say, well, the Assumption's not in the Bible. Well, you're right, it isn't. But the idea of the Assumption is, I just read it. And it's the idea that we will be changed and transformed into our resurrected bodies. And this is a very relevant point to what we are going to be discussing in Genesis. Because when Adam and Eve were initially created, they were created whole beings. What do you mean whole beings? I mean they were a perfect unity of body and soul. A perfect unity of body and soul that was never meant to be separated. Okay? What do we call the separation of the soul from the body? Death. There was no death. When they sinned, we say death entered into the world. Why? Because what was God's injunction? He says, don't eat that fruit, otherwise you will die. Well, Adam and Eve didn't drop dead right there. What happened? They began spiritual death. They began a separation of their relationship with God. Later, physical death followed that. Spiritual death came first. The spiritual separation of their relationship between their Creator and themselves. That was the initial death that occurred, and it occurred immediately. The separation of the soul from the body is physical death. Physical death. That was never supposed to be the human condition. Do you understand that? It was never meant to be. That was not God's plan. When we were created to be a whole being, body and soul united forever. Sin destroyed that relationship. And now what happens is people die physically. What happens? The soul leaves the body. That's death. What you end up with instead of a human being is you end up with a corpse and a ghost. Neither of which is fully human any longer. Neither of which by themselves is fully human. Because a human being is a body, soul united permanently. So Our Lady is the first to experience the new glorified bodies that we will all share at the end of time. Jesus was the first, and he gave it to his mother second. And then all of us will share in it as well. Okay? What I read in the meditation for the Assumption was just a little bit of what Paul had to say about this unique transformation of the human person, where we will be permanently reunited to our bodies. We were made to be body, soul, united beings. It is not God's will that we are pure spirits. That's not the human condition. Angels are pure spirits. We are not. We are body-soul connections, and we will be that way again at the end of time. So what happens in between time? What happens when people die? Well, their soul goes to God, and their body is buried here on the earth. Okay? That's what happens. And the saints in heaven are waiting, anxiously awaiting, for the reunification of their bodies at the end of time. Yes?
Is there anybody, I'm not gay, so I apologize if I'm asking a silly question, but is there anybody else like Mary in the Bible that has what you're talking about besides
Elijah.
Jesus and Mary?
I would argue that both Elijah and most likely Moses and Enoch have this reunification as well.
Does Joseph, Jesus' father, have anything like that?
Not that I know of, no. Neither does Peter, Paul, John, James, St. Bartholomew, none of them. Good question, though. Yeah, that's the other precedent one could argue. Where is this idea of the Assumption in the Bible? Well, I would argue that Elijah is the most vivid biblical example of it.
What is he?
He was a prophet in Israel during one of its most wicked times. And at the end of his ministry, God took him into heaven in a whirlwind. So he didn't die like we experienced it. So his body must have been transformed on the journey up to heaven. That's the only explanation. Similarly, in the book of Genesis, we read about Enoch. Enoch, it said, walked with God and was no more, for God took him. That's all it says. So again, it implies he didn't die, he was taken up. Now, Elijah would be the most vivid example because it's very clear in the scriptures. He went up into heaven in a whirlwind and he didn't die. Enoch, you might argue, died and went with God, but it doesn't imply that. That would be another person. Moses, I would say, is a third because in Jewish tradition, this is Jewish tradition, that when Moses died, his body didn't stay on earth but was translated into heaven. In fact, there's a very famous battle over the body of Moses in Jewish tradition. Satan comes to steal the body of Moses. And the archangel Michael comes to defend him from that. And they have a little fight, and Michael wins, of course.
Is it in the Bible?
And the way you mentioned that, it is. There's a verse in the book of Jude that alludes to this, where it says that it's talking about false teachers and how they overstep their bounds. And he said, not even the archangel Michael, when disputing over the body of Moses, dared to presume, but simply said, the Lord rebuke you. To imply that Michael knew his place, Satan did not. Michael knew what the limits of his authority were. He had no power, he referred to God. God wanted this, the devil had no claim, and the story is over. as far as he was concerned. He said, "The Lord rebuke you, Satan." Not I. The Lord rebuke you. And this is it is a very clear reference to this apocryphal story in Jewish tradition called the Assumption of Moses. So, yes. So I would also argue that Moses experienced this as well. Okay?
Moses, like, with the parting of the Red Sea and all of that, that implies that he has that power already, though, before he does? Or
It wasn't his power, it was God's power.
Sorry, God's power.
Right.
That implies that it's kind of already happened, right? This, maybe I'm not asking right, but you said it's like when he died. That
He did die, yes.
Yeah, but didn't it show that he kind of, it was already going to happen when he had all these special gifts that were coming from God, or like parting the Red Sea?
Yeah.
I don't
I'm not
know.
sure I know what you're
I
asking.
know, I don't know how to, I'll come back.
Okay, no problem, no problem. So anyway, when we get close to mid-August about this, I'll spend a little more time on the Assumption. This was one of those areas when I was in my process of converting that I had a problem with. Because, again, I approached everything, well, if it's not in the scriptures, then why are we believing it? Why are we making up doctrines? Where does this come from? If it's not in here, where does it come from? And that kind of leads me into kind of talking a little bit about myself. I hope you don't mind. Oh, thank you. This week, I went to Knott's Berry Farm. I wanted to see the Independence Hall. Have you ever been to Independence Hall at Knott's Berry Farm?
No.
It's an exact replica of the Independence Hall that's in Pittsburgh. I'm sorry, Philadelphia. It's an exact replica. What's his name? Walter Knott? The guy who did Knott's Berry Farm. He was a big patriot, and he replicated this exactly. What Independence Hall is. And you can go, it's free. You can just go in and see a mock-up of the Liberty Bell. You can see a mock-up of the room in which the Declaration of Independence was signed, and so forth. And I said, you know what? I hadn't been there since I was in 4th grade.